Hey students, in this video we're going to be talking about the Federal Reserve. What does the Federal Reserve do, and how does this affect the money market? The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 to help prevent bank failures from bank runs. Prior to the Federal Reserve, if a bank ran out of money, the bank failed along with all the deposits with it. In 1933, during the Great Depression, FDR signed into law the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, because despite the Federal Reserve being in operation, banks were still failing from bank runs. The FDIC guarantees a certain amount of money, today $250,000, to be insured by the government and protect people's deposits. This has been largely successful to prevent people from draining their bank accounts of their life savings. The Federal Reserve is separated into 12 regions with a Federal Reserve Bank to govern those regions. One is in downtown Dallas. Each bank is privately owned but does have a board of governors that oversees the entire system. There are 7 governors' seats that are nominated by the president and approved by the Senate, and they serve for 14-year terms. Okay, now for the economic role of the Federal Reserve. The Fed controls the expansion and contraction of the money supply, interest rates, and the reserve requirement. The Fed also serves as a bank for banks, but this is not the best option for banks. You are already familiar with the reserve requirement, and that is a percentage of reserves that have to be set aside. Now, let's say the Fed has a reserve rate at 5%. Brit Bank is loaned out, meaning it has no excess reserves, and has the 5% set to the side like it's supposed to. The Fed calls and says, hey, the rate is now 7%. Brit Bank has to get the other 2%, but is loaned out and does not have enough daily or monthly deposits to meet the requirement. Brit Bank has the option to borrow from banks on the federal funds market. The federal funds market allows banks to borrow from other banks. The loan it receives is subject to the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is the interest rate charged on loans charged from banks to other banks. Now, let's say that Brit Bank is unable to get a loan from another bank. Brit Bank can borrow from the Federal Reserve via the discount window. But this action is of last resort because they will be charged the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate charged on loans to banks from the Fed. The discount rate is higher rate of interest than the federal funds rate. It's usually 1% higher. If you find out your bank is going to the Fed for funds, that means that they're hitting hard times. The Fed controls the expansion and contraction of the money supply, but in a indirect manner. It is not as simple as just printing money, because that would cause massive inflation of the currency and bring up aggregate price levels. Instead, the Fed uses open market operations. Open market operations are the purchase and sale of government debt to and from banks. This is where the money multiplier comes in again. It's more than just banks lending money. The money multiplier applies to the open market operations. First, let's say a bank needs money. The Fed will not just inject money. The Fed will purchase treasury bills from banks at their value. So let's say that Brit Bank needs $100 million and it holds $100 million in treasury bills. The Fed can purchase the treasury bills from Brit Bank, thus granting them the money. This will increase the monetary base of the money supply. Now, as you know, banks do not hold onto that money in its vaults. They lend them out. Now, let's say the reserve requirement is 5%. Brit Bank leads out all of its excess reserves. Now, how much does this increase the money supply? You apply the money multiplier to find out. So after you take out the 5% for the required reserves, you should be left with 95 million times 1 over 0.05. You times that out, and that will be 95 million times 20, and this will have an effect of 1.9 billion of an increase in the money supply. The final result is the $1.9 billion. The Fed also controls the interest rates that are charged for loans and certificates of deposits. These interest rates determine whether people, banks, or companies will borrow, lend, or keep their money on hand. We can track this behavior with the money demand curve with the money market model. The y-axis shows the interest rate, the x-axis shows the quantity of money, and the green line is the money demand curve labeled MD. The black vertical line is the money supply. This is vertical because it is under control of the Federal Reserve. The colors will not be constant. I'm only using those to make the model look pretty and easier to read on the screen. This model demonstrates the relationship between interest rates and the quantity of money demanded. As the rates rise, the demand for money goes down. As rates go down, the demand for money goes up. The aggregate price level determines the movement of the money demand curve as well. If prices rise 10% on the market, the demand for money will rise 10% as well. This is because people need 10% more money than they needed prior. The money demand curve also influences GDP. If people are confident in the economy and spending more, they will demand more money. This works the opposite as well. If people have fear about the economy, they are less likely to spend money and therefore will demand less money. So we talked about how the Federal Reserve changes the interest rate. The Federal Reserve changes the interest rate by changing the money supply. We talked about how they can do this a moment ago. The three tools that the Fed has to change the money supply are open market operations, the reserve requirement, and the discount window. We're going to stop here for now because the money market model is married to another model, the loanable funds market model, which we will go over in Module 29. Until then, please wash your hands, do not touch your face, and stay inside. Now, if you watch this video from beginning to the end, the key word is bacon. Say bacon at the beginning of the next class, and you'll get some extra credit.